Hello, everyone. Um, if you are returning from earlier, thank you for coming back. And if you're just hopping on for the first time today, welcome. So I'm going to start, before I introduce our next speaker, just as a reminder that we will have a Q&A segment following the presentation. So feel free to add any questions you think of during the presentation into the chat. You can also send me a private message if you feel more comfortable. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker for the day, who is Dr. Deborah D. Stine, who is the founder of the Science and Technology Policy Academy, which provides independent consulting, policy analysis, program evaluation, freelance writing, teaching, and coaching services. Previously, she served in the Obama White House as Executive Director of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, a Science and Technology Specialist at the Congressional Research Service, a Study Director at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and as a professor of the Practice in Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Stine was elected a Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, quote, for her major long-term contributions to national science and technology policy and the development of the science and technology policy workforce of the future, end quote. She received a Carnegie Science Communication Award for her ability to explain complex scientific and technical information to policymakers and the public. She has a BS in Mechanical and Environmental Engineering, an MBA, and a PhD in Public Policy Analysis and Public Administration. Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it off to Dr. Stine.
Thanks for the introduction. Hold on a second while I bring these slides up. I have to make sure I have the right ones because I was also working on a talk I'm doing next week. So while I'm doing that, if I'd appreciate it if you could if you could just introduce yourself in chat. Oh, here we go. And just so I know who's out there. And ignore the sound in the back. This is my dog having a reverse sneeze attack. He unfortunately got pneumonia a few weeks ago. I'm trying to, there you go. Okay. Okay, well, thanks, for introducing yourselves. So I see, Ruby, you're a T32 postdoc, which I think is an NIH sort of designation. So why don't you tell me like what institution you're at and something about the research work that you are doing. Okay, so first, what's public policy? Public policy is political decisions that are for implementing programs to achieve societal goals. And so I'd like for you first to talk about a policy, put this in chat, that has personally impacted you or your family members. So if you could just type that into chat, that would be great. Okay, so next thing I wanted to talk about is a policymaker and who that is. So lots of times people think that a policymaker is only somebody who's in the who's involved like in the political process, but it's really much more than that. You know, in general, it could be anybody. It could be somebody in a business, at a university, a foundation, or a non-governmental organization. And those are the ones who are trying to figure out what to do. So you might say, oh, like, you know, Google has this new policy on reducing their impact on the environment, a sustainable development project. Now, nobody required them to do that, but they're doing it on their own. And sometimes voluntary action makes a big difference. And universities also play a big role, as you will also see. Okay, so now I want you to think about a policymaker who has made a decision that has impacted you or your family. I like this one, listen about airline security policies, which is good. Okay. So can you name just like somebody who, you know, it might be somebody who really impacted some decision about maybe, say, getting your that T-32 grant, for example, like who that goes to. Okay. So this is a definition of science technology policy that I quite like. It's actually from the 1970s. It's from somebody named, from a committee chaired by Harvey Brooks. It's an international definition because it was developed as an international organization. Harvey Brooks was a professor at Harvard. So science and technology is concerned with the allocation of resources for scientific research and technical development. It includes government encouragement of science technology as a roots of strategy for industrial development and economic growth, but it also includes the use of science in connection with the problems of the public sector. So oftentimes, you know, a lot of the presentation you'll hear, well, they'll be focusing more on getting like more money, you know, for the scientific research enterprise, more funding for research. And of course that helps society. But, you know, if you're, another really important part of research is what is called science for policy, where you're trying to take what we have learned through research and then use that information to enhance society. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. So you'll see here, this is a table. This is from my book, which is now in editing, and hopefully I'm going to have out pretty soon. And it talks about sort of this relationship between science, technology, and policymaking. So sometimes we have public policy influencing science and technology, which in brief we say is policy for science. And this is basically, you know, sometimes it'll be how to fund or manage research, or sometimes there might be a decision made about like not to fund research and how to prioritize research. So for example, how much public funding should support research on climate change and how to prioritize that research funding. Now, as an engineer, I always like to think about also technology, and sort of the same thing is happening there. So when we have a new technology, let's say nanotechnology, things like that, or in this case, one of our big issues is self-driving cars, then that's another thing, another way that policy can influence technology. It can make decisions like, should we support it by providing research funding, to trying to look at how, say, nanotechnology research should be allocated, all sorts of different things. And then we have the science, you know, for policy, where we're trying to use our scientific and technical information to enhance and inform that policy making. So here we're, not just like looking at how much funding should go to research and climate change, but trying to understand the impacts of climate change and what decisions should be made. And also things like, now that we have these self-driving cars, how should they be regulated to protect public safety? So one question for you is, are you more interested in policy for science or science for policy? Okay. So we have at least one science for policy. Usually I get a pretty good mix in response to this question, because but it really does, make a difference, what it is that you're focused on. So the other thing to think about is looking at these different ways of engagement. So you have the pure scientist. And the pure scientist is somebody who just wants to sort of stay in their lab and, they don't want to have any real interaction with the policymakers or the public. And I'm sure you probably have met people like this. And then you have the issue advocate, and that's sort of the opposite extreme. So, for example, at one of the last meetings of on climate change, some scientist went and put chains around themselves around organizations that they thought were supporting climate change, the activities that lead to climate change. So around banks and things like that. So that's sort of the other extreme. Then you have the science arbiters. Those are places like the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine, where the goal is to bring people together and scientists together and other experts and say, okay, well, what should we do about climate change? The very first study that I worked on when I was, as I say, a baby engineer at the National Academies was basically, what should we do about climate change? And that was a very, very long time ago. And then there was an honest broker of policy alternatives. And those are the people who go and they want to make, basically evidence-based policy and do what's called speaking truth to power. So in my personal case, I might, because part of what I do is as a consultant is I do analysis for people. There might be somebody that I'm working with, that might be a president or some senior official, and they really just love this idea. They said, oh, we want, like electric vehicles to take over every one of our fleet vehicles. And by this, by doing this, we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and, really present a good view and meet some regulatory goal. And sometimes I might have to tell them, well, that's a really worthy goal, but for right now, at least, most of the electricity in this region where I am, which is in Pittsburgh, comes from fossil fuels. And so even though electric vehicles in the future might be like a good option, right now, you might have more impact reducing greenhouse gas emissions by changing your gasoline vehicles to, say, hybrid vehicles instead. And that's like based on a real study that was published in a journal. And sometimes they're not going to necessarily like that answer, but it's your job to kind of tell them the bad news. So as you might have guessed, my next question is, which of these is most interest to you? Now I'm going to flip back to the previous slide. What often happens is that people will tell me they're this now, but they want to be that in the future. Or sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, I want to be, whatever it is. The key is not that any of these are wrong, but that you understand where you are within the policy world. So let's take a moment and think about which of these that you are. Okay. So we have Kimberly as an issue advocate. Okay. Also Ruby. Okay, so we have a lot of people in this group so far who are science for policy people and also issue advocates, and focusing within that on DEI. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to give a case study. This is about minority serving institutions, which is a very interesting history. So if we go back sort of in time, go back in the United States as far as the 1600s, then Harvard College was actually, which was one of the first colleges, maybe the first college in the United States. They had an Indian college with 20 students, but only 2 received their bachelor's degree, and the rest either left or ended up dying due to poor living conditions. So that was definitely not a really great educational environment for them. So then Dartmouth College came around, and this is for educating Native peoples, which what today we would maybe call First Nations. And then in 1837, so quite a bit later, we have our first historically Black college and university that was founded. So this all changed with the advent of the Moral Act, which was the goal here was to say, rather than just having, like a Harvard University that was only for one part of the United States, and this is in the 1860s, we would instead have a land-grant university in every state. So you'll see here that this is still an important part of the United States ecosystem, in that there is, you can look at a state like maybe not your current state, but your home state, whatever it might be, and there is a college for you to attend. Nobody had to continue, and this is, remember, about 100 years or so after the founding of the United States, had to go to the East to get a college level education. So that was a good thing, but there was a problem. And the problem is that this is also around the civil rights, the Civil War era. And people who were Black had a hard time getting into some of these institutions. So an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau began to establish HBCUs. And again, this is important to understand because it wasn't the government who did this, but it was private organizations that they said, hey, we need to solve this problem and we're going to establish HBCUs. And you'll see here that it also included another organization that was active were white Northern missionary societies. And they also, founded some of these organizations. So by the 1944, around World War II, there was a creation of the United Negro College Fund. And that was the way that people were able to afford to go to these colleges. Then about 10 years later, we had Brown versus Board of Education, which was ending segregation. Now, you'll see here in 1890, we had the second Moral Act, and that was supporting these 17 HBCUs throughout the South. And that was because of the Southern states that were not going to let people of color into their universities. And so you'll see that this was very important, because I like this picture because it shows what was being done in HBCUs at the time. So you see that, you have a good portion of both women and men, and they're learning here about the Earth's rotation around the sun. This was at the Hampton Institute, which is one of the first HBCUs. And what these people were doing is not only learning these things for themselves, but they would go out and become teachers. And that was the original focus of HBCUs, because that was a way of spreading knowledge throughout the community. Yes, I already did that one. So the in 1965, the Higher Education Act was passed. And so this is again a public policy. And HBCUs were redefined as any college university established prior to 64 whose principal mission was education of Black Americans. And then in 68, you'll see that that Hostas, hopefully I'm saying that right, community college focused on educating Latino population in South Bronx in New York. So it was the first bilingual institution. Then there was more power given to the tribal communities. And then there was the first Navajo Nation tribally controlled college. And then these tribal colleges formed the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. So though a lot of this, the early days started with Black Americans, it was then spreading to other, minority populations. And we can sort of see the importance of this action. But it doesn't mean that there still were not barriers. This was kind of both a sad story and also like a remarkable story. And this is about somebody named Percy Julian. So Harvard gave him a scholarship to get a master's degree, but they won't allow him to enter their PhD program. And he was his focus was chemistry. So instead, he went to Europe and he got his PhD in Europe. He was hired by a university, but then they refused to make him a full professor, even though he was acclaimed internationally. So he left academia, probably a wise move at the time. He established his own company and he sold it, and he became one of the first Black millionaires in the United States. And then he ran a nonprofit. So you see here that he was granted over 130 patents during his lifetime. And the reason I think this is a good story about somebody like this who really helped break down the barriers is that it shows that policies, again, are not just from the government, but universities, right? So it was all these universities that made these decisions. And in some cases, there were 2 universities in the United States whose policies stopped his ability to be educated, but an organization, a university in Europe said he could be educated. And so these are the different policies. And so sometimes you really have to focus on those particular policymakers, particularly when it comes to STEM education, because there's only so much that the federal government can do. A lot of decisions, and we found this out during the pandemic, are made by state and local organizations. So sorry. So the my poor dog here. It's okay. So the you continue to see through the 1970s this what happened originally with the Black colleges and universities was spreading through other diverse communities. And then you'll see here an important thing was in 1986, where there was a special clause that was added to the Higher Education Act to ensure that funding was allocated for HBCUs, because it's still even a challenge today at some of the smaller HBCUs to really advance. And then again, you'll see this, we have Native Americans, Hispanic serving institutions. You really start to see this sort of the spread. And then, but you'll see it took all the way till 1994 before land grant status was given to the tribal colleges. And that's important because there's certain allocations, particularly at the USDA, that provide funding allocation, for land grant universities. And this allowed them, more access to funds. So interestingly, I just like this past week, I was just kind of randomly looking on Facebook, and I found out this latest news. So this is like, March 2023 news, that Navajo Tech is the first tribal university to offer a PhD program. And to me, it's just amazing we have all these tribal universities and colleges, and it took this long for them to be able to offer, a PhD program. And the program you'll see here is focused on Dene, I think is how you say it, which is their culture and language. And you also see over here that they are now having this laboratory trying to build manufacturing capacity, within the Navajo lands. So this is a battle, a policy debate that is still continuing today, and it will probably still continue in the future. So another example of where science influenced it is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You saw a lot of those policies were in the late 1960s when civil rights were a big portion of the activity. And the study, which was done by these, here we go, Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, they concluded that prejudice, discrimination, segregation caused Black children to develop a sense of inferiority and self-hatred, and that there was an overall harmful effect that segregation posed to African-American children. And this was part of the justification, for saying that the separate but equal method of education was unconstitutional. And then you'll see also on this other article that's on the right, where we're talking about, how the civil rights and implementation, how they affect social determinants of health, which again is sort of a long standing issue, that we still have, people of color who are having challenges with persistent health inequities, regardless of income. And so this is still a continuing concept where science and technical research can help advance public policy. So this is a study from the National Academies. This is the National Academies of Science, Teaching, and Medicine, and those are it's not part of the government if you're not familiar with them, but they are an honorific organization where people are elected to membership. But their studies are conducted by many people other than the members, but they're good as a third-party assessment for like how the government is doing in some areas. This is one of the places I worked. I worked there for like 18 years. And in fact, I actually worked on a study about this, not minority serving institutions, but basically the education of people from underrepresented groups. So what they found, looking at the effectiveness of minority serving institutions, that they played a critical role in training education for students of color in STEM, and that they were diverse student bodies, and not just for race and ethnicity, but also income, enrollment, intensity, and academic preparations. And they emphasize the importance of taking into effect these contextual factors, such as their financial circumstances, life stage, work, family commitments, all these other kinds of things. And then they also emphasize the importance of 2-year MSIs, not just 4 years. So this is also something which has been found that, like community colleges, which is what generally what we call a 2-year institution, that they are very important feeders into 4-year institutions, for the STEM disciplines, because it provides a standard basis for everybody. So no matter what school, high school that you came from, you can go to a 2-year MSI, and you can get to the same level, so you can be competitive, and hopefully you'll stay in as opposed to dropping out. This is just like an anecdote from my days. So when I went to get my engineering degree at UC Irvine, which is in Southern California, and there was a fellow student of mine, and she was like valedictorian of her class. She grew up in Needles, California, though, which is like in the middle of the desert in California. And, it was even that sort of long ago, it was a college that expected you to have completed calculus and other things before you even got to the college. And if not, you were put in a remedial program. And so in this particular case, the student, even though she was a valedictorian of her high school, she had to spend her first year in remedial classes just to enter in the first level classes, at this University of California campus. And so it really shows what a challenge it can be to get to that equal playing field. So here is the overview of all the MSIs and so forth. So you can sort of see, where they are at. And it's just a reminder that they're now all over, the United States, like the HBCUs, when they started, were just primarily in the southern states. But now we have MSIs in every state. And, the way this, chart works is that, it's like how many are in each state. And of course, it makes sense for some of the smaller states like Montana and things like that in terms of population to have less institutions, and for more populous states like Texas and California to have more. But this is a phenomenon that started out small, just, like a dozen or so colleges. And then, now we're talking, in the hundreds providing these services. Okay, so this is just kind of like my checkpoint before we go further to say, do you have any questions? What have you learned so far? What has surprised you? So, and you're also welcome to open up your mic there if you just like ask a question, since we have a small audience here.
Well, this is Kimberly. Something I learned, which I guess is kind of obvious, but I didn't really even think about the way university policies could be so influential in like a student's journey. I mean, because usually, thinking state, local, federal level, but at that university level, I hadn't even really thought about that.
Yeah, to me, it's, on this particular issue, it's like super important. The universities are the ones who make decisions about, for example, faculty hiring, how they gather the pool of people that they hire. You're much more likely, to be able to attract students from underrepresented groups if you have faculty from underrepresented groups. It's the same thing, for women. And so every policy, from the top down, really makes a difference. So if they decide, okay, well, in my mind, that there's a lot of universities that kind of give like lip service to diversity kinds of issues. And that's because they're not really willing to measure it. And this is one of these things where, what you measure is what you get. And, the policies they put in place can either encourage or discourage students, as well as faculty. And the challenge is who makes those decisions. Like at least most institutions I know, the graduate programs, the master's and PhD programs, all those decisions are made by faculty. Faculty are also the ones who make the decision who to hire and who to fire and what's considered to be appropriate for getting tenure. So, managing faculty is not an easy thing. And so it really takes university leadership to decide what to do and to overrule, like the faculty sometimes as to what might happen. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't, as you saw on the case of Dr. Julian there. So does that help? I'm just gonna forgot who has
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. So based on your research and experience, do you feel there's been significant improvement in equity university policies during the past 3 years as they're advertising DEI initiatives? And sort of like I said before, I'm piloting a class on diversity analysis and or equity analysis, I should say, and equity analysis meaning very broadly. So not just race and ethnicity, but things like geographic and so forth. And I personally am not convinced that progress is being made. You can sometimes see it. So like, I mentioned I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon, and because of some women in computer science, like in the early days, computer science was dominated by women. That's like how like Hidden Figures, you might remember that movie came about. It was a field at that point that women were really the key people. And then in computer science, it declined. And so like at one point that I remember, it was like only about, say, 10% of the students were women. And but some institutions, if they really focus on it, can make a difference. So at Carnegie Mellon, there were like some women computer science faculty who were quite well known. They put together a program, and as I can't remember exactly how many years ago, but within the past like 10 years, like over 50% of the computer science enrollees were women. And computer science at Carnegie Mellon is very, very hard to get into. It's one of the hardest in the country. And I've heard other stories about particular institutions who are able to kind of break those thresholds and increase it. The most famous one for underrepresented groups is UMBC, the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And it was again because of a leader who had a special program, where it was a cohort of people from underrepresented groups. That's sort of the main thing that I learned from that program. So the way I explain this is that so I take a Pilates class like every day. It's like 12 people. That's how many like reformers and so forth are in there. And every once in a while, and I've been doing this for years and years, a man comes in, because otherwise it's all women. And that man never lasts very long because they're alone. They are the only one, and they kind of feel out of place, right? And so this is what happens, when it comes to faculty, like you're the only woman, or you're the only person of color, or whatever it is, and you're the one, and everybody's like looking at you, staring at you really different. And at a certain point in time, you feel uncomfortable, and you voluntarily depart. This happened in my PhD program. We had just like one person of color who came in, and he was gone within, like the first semester or something like that. So there has to be new ways of doing things. And I think there's plenty of case studies that are out there, but really putting them into place takes money and leadership. And so far, we are seeing it in rare occasions, but we're not really seeing it as a common equation. So, I think the Biden administration has put a lot of equity policies into place, and hopefully this will improve. But as you can sort of see, just from the Navajo example that I gave, it seems to take forever because there's no accountability. There's nobody who's really kind of keeping track of these things. So I hope that answered your question, Millicent. Yes. Okay, great. Anybody else before I move on? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to get into policy analysis. So one of the one of the aspects that I find is that a lot of people say, okay, this is how to write a memo or whatever it might be, but they don't really focus on the content of that memo, just kind of on the form of that memo. So I'm going to focus on, so these are like 8 steps in policy analysis. And then these are, I'm going to focus on these ones in red, basically the criteria. And these are the things that are important for you to address in any sort of analysis. So these are what I call the 4 E's. And so what happens is that when you're working on policy, so let's just take it. Okay, well, we want to with something kind of like based on research. So we want to look at the when scientists and engineers do research, right? What they're really looking at is just how effective a policy is. So what action can we take to, say, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or, what actions can we take to increase the number of underrepresented groups, members of underrepresented groups who get degrees in STEM. And so we look at the effectiveness of the policy, the degree to which it's likely to reach that societal goal, but we often don't look at these other 3 E's. And when we don't look at them and don't account for them, then the policymakers, whether it's somebody at a university or a government official, they have to, they don't have the information they need to make a decision, and they might not quite be willing to listen to what you have to say. So, for example, I just talked about this case at UMBC, right, where they have a cohort of people, I'm trying to remember what the name of the program is, but it's like something scholars, that they have been able to successfully diversify their education, their population of people from underrepresented groups attending the institution. So this program has been shown to be effective, okay, but you also need to understand how much it cost, right? So for the program to be duplicated in other areas, let's just say the University of Maryland College Park, which is a much bigger campus than University of Maryland Baltimore County, you need to understand like how much is spent on the current policy, which might be say scholarships, versus this more cohort model where people like live together for the summer before they enter in the institution, they have activities throughout the year, so forth. So it's a much bigger financial investment. But for the societal goal that you're trying to reach, it might make, the most sense. And so you have to understand the cost of the current policy and then the cost of the proposed policy. And so you can figure out what gets the best bang for your buck. So maybe, maybe your institution says it can't afford this UMBC model. So what's another option that you could put into place? Maybe instead of having it for, like one summer, maybe you do it for like 2 weeks, something like that. And so as a policymaker, when you have a limited budget, you have to know what's going to get the biggest bang for the buck. Then you also need to understand the equity issues, right? So who are the winners and who are the losers? So the reason people sometimes get mad at diversity policies or DEI policies is because they think that they're going to become losers if that policy is put into place. And there's always winners and there's always losers in any policy. The key is to design the policy in such a way that the people who are losers don't feel that they are losing too much. And so you really need to understand those equity issues. And then the last one is ease of political acceptability. And that is understanding who are the key players and if there's going to be too much opposition or too little support. Because, realistically, every state is different. So I do a lot of work in West Virginia, for example, And the culture and politics of West Virginia is quite different from Pennsylvania, which is quite different from Massachusetts, which is quite different from Maine, right? And this is where state policies and state culture come into play. And so you need to understand how hard it's going to be to implement this policy. And then again, try to adjust it to figure out what happens. So what you do in policy analysis, you have your status quo, which is your current policy, and then you come up with two alternatives to that policy that you think will enhance the likelihood of reaching that societal goal. And then you need to do that analysis of all four of these, the effectiveness, the efficiency, the equity, and the ease of acceptability, to figure out, the best policy to recommend to that policymaker to move forward. And policymakers are just like anybody else. They want options. And you're better off kind of doing the analysis, showing these options, showing how they're doing in this 4E analysis, before, in terms of the likelihood of like moving forward. So I wanted to now show this little video. It is funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and it shows like the difference between equality and equity. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't understand. And because of this, it can also lead to challenges when you're discussing these policies with policymakers, like trying to advocate for a change in a policy. So I'm going to start this off. It's very short.
These days, we hear a lot of people using the word equity, but what does it really mean? It's not quite the same as equality, which means everybody gets treated the same. Equity is about fairness. It means that everybody gets what they need based on their own situation, because we're not all the same. The difference between equality and equity is important. It's part of the reason the United States spends more on healthcare per person than any other advanced nation and has much poorer health. It's important to remember that a person's health depends on many factors, things like their environment, schools, and workplaces, to name a few. We call these social determinants of health, like clean drinking water for children and easy access to fresh food. We can follow the lead of communities like Columbia Gorge in Washington and Oregon, where businesses, doctors, and farmers tackled the local hunger problem with the Veggie RX voucher program. And the New Jersey Partnership for Healthy Kids is bringing down high rates of obesity in underserved communities. We should be inspired by these local efforts. And remember that health equity is all about making things better for all of us. When everyone's healthy, everyone benefits.
Okay, go back. So, I sort of talked about this. So did you guys already know this difference between equity and equality? Is this something that makes sense to you? As I'm sort of waiting up. Yeah, okay, good. Yes, okay, good, thank you. It makes more sense, yeah. Yeah, so I think having that kind of simple explanation really helps. And I think, even showing like when you're having these discussions about equity, at, your institution, even with people who are familiar with the concept, it's important to understand that not everybody sort of gets it. It's what it would be in the business called jargon. And so that makes it really hard for people to talk at the same level, to really engage, because you're coming from two different images of what these things are like. So the Biden administration, I think this is a really a good example, has issued a good number of executive orders that are related to equity issues. I like, there's like about 3 or 4 of them. There's a Justice 40 initiative, all these different kinds of things. But from what I've seen in my engagement with the federal government, is the agencies are still trying to kind of figure this out. And this is where, you can play a role by trying to influence those policies, give them comments and all sorts of things that are happening. So the concept here is this whole of government equity agenda. So if you go and there's like a whole web page on this, you can sort of see what's happening at the agencies, related to equity. And so going back to the question earlier, that's part of the reason is by looking at that website and seeing what's happening at the agencies. I'm like, I don't think we're quite there yet, but you got to take a first step. And this is a really good first step. I think this is, I like the fact that they defined equity in this executive order about consistent, systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including those in underserved communities. And then you'll see a whole list of people here. And I think what's important is to recognize that besides these kind of, like I think the more obvious things when people think of equity, that it also means people who live in rural areas and people who are adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. So like I said, I worked in West Virginia, and they have actually a very, very small minority population in the state, like just a few percentages. But the small percentage they have is in an area that is unfortunately very polluted due to its past history. But there's many people in the state who fall into these like last two categories, where they're in rural areas, which means they don't have a lot of access to resources. And then also they're in poverty because it's one of the poorest states in the country. And this is, West Virginia is a mixed story, so it's partly in the southern part of the state. So I think, by having this kind of broader definition of equity, they're making it, you might say, a bit more inclusive sometimes. And again, that's very important when you're interacting with people who might say like, okay, what's this equity thing anyhow? And sometimes they can understand some of these other concepts, of what equity means, as opposed to ones that are race or gender or sexual identity based. And then you can use that, like I have a whole nother session, like how to interact with people who disagree with you. Sometimes if you start from that base, well, saying, oh, don't you want to help people who are poor or whatever, then it's a way to kind of bring them in to the conversation by focusing on where they agree, and then where they might disagree now, but maybe you can convince them by starting with the areas where you agree. And this is an important tactic, so if you have somebody who disagrees on climate change, you don't focus on climate change, you instead focus on flooding. Because flooding is something that affects everybody. And then you move into, the other aspects of climate change. It's some people kind of might see it as deceiving, but it's really more just trying to find common ground and build that relationship. I have at this table, this is in my book, but it's part of something in marketing. And marketing is called know, like, trust. So people have to get to know who you are. They have to like what you're saying, and then they trust you. And when they get to that trust point, that's when you can start to push the margins. And they're willing to have a dialogue with you and willing to consider policies that might be a challenge if you come from the opposite way. Does that make sense to you guys, what I just said? Hopefully. Yes. Okay, good. At least one person there. Thank you, Kimberly. Yes. Yeah. So just really, like I said, start with your common ground and you'll make sense. So this underserved community aspect of it is, it's basically the same as before, but you're focusing on, instead of individual people, you're focused on some particular characteristic or geographic community. So like part of the analysis, I worked with West Virginia University on a policymaker guide on carbon dioxide removal. And the focus that we did was not on the entire state of West Virginia for like direct air capture and carbon storage, but on the southern part of the state. And that's because that is a part of the state that is the poorest, that has the highest unemployment rate, and is the most diverse. And, you know, by doing that, we were saying that sometimes you're not going to make the decision that, okay, we're just going to do it near Pittsburgh or in northern West Virginia, where all the industry is, because it's easier there. It's going to cost less. That's that efficiency measure. Instead, we're going to let equity dominate. And so, you know, you don't have to, each of those 4 E's doesn't have to have equal weight. By letting equity dominate instead, we're saying that, hey, if we're going to make federal government investment in carbon capture, it should be in that southern part of the state. And that's where the analysis was done. So then there's also this Justice 40 initiative, and you'll see here that we have lots of things here: climate change, clean energy, energy efficient, clean transit, sustainable housing, workforce development. So there's a lot of things in this Justice 40 activity. So even though you might think like environmental justice means just environmental stuff, the concept of environment is very broad, you know. So like when you're talking about clean transit, you know, it could be all sorts of different kinds of transportation, which, yes, you know, would reduce emissions, but also, again, help the entire population. I mean, I'm sure it's been a long time since I've been on the metro system in DC, but when I was there, you know, it was definitely like falling apart a bit. And I think in my last years in DC, I lived there for about 30 years. It got to the point where that, you know, there were derailments and all sorts of things. And so I, you know, kind of lost confidence in the public transit system and switched to just like taking Ubers instead, because at this point in my life, I can afford it. But definitely my younger days, I could not afford it, particularly the parking. And that's kind of where those equity issues come in, right? When you're trying to think about it, because if you don't have, you know, good transit, then it's really hard. And it also needs to be affordable, which is also important. I did some focus groups here in Pittsburgh with people who are unemployed. And one of the biggest challenges for them, because they have no car, is transportation. So we have a bus system here, but the challenge is the bus system doesn't go to where the manufacturing jobs are. So although manufacturing is desperate for workers, and we have workers who are desperate for employment, it's transportation, which is the barrier for that to occur. And it's just making that link between the poor part of Pittsburgh and the part of Pittsburgh that has the jobs. Here's something else that they, oh, I'm sorry, I see something down here. Do you think civic contributions to climate science included in FEMA mandated disaster preparedness plans fall under Justice 40? To me, that is a definite yes. Yeah. One of the big things that I preach, and actually it works out well that we have here this map. So one irritation that I have a scientist, and so I ask this question at about every climate change related event that I go to, and like I said, I've been working on climate change for decades and decades, since I was a baby engineer, is that there's, to me, the scientific community focuses too much on the coast, you know, like what's going to happen in Florida and along the eastern seaboard and things like that, right? And the challenge is that climate change affects everywhere in the United States, not just the coast. But because scientists are so focused on saying, oh, this is the worst case scenarios, which are the sea level rise, and you'll see this always in the presentations, you know, along the East Coast, they've made the people in the center of the country think that climate change is not going to affect them, when nothing could be further from the truth, because you're going to have more intense rain conditions, more flooding, and we're seeing that. But people are not connecting it to climate change because the scientists are only talking about it in the coast. And this to me is like a real problem. By not not taking a full equity perspective on their presentation and thinking about everybody in the country. And then they complain as to why people don't want to think it's necessary to take action on climate change. It's because the scientists themselves are not communicating that message, about the danger of flooding and fires and all these other kinds of things that are related to climate change, that all of which happen as much in the center of the country, as on the coast. And so it's like, why should we in, Nebraska care about those people in Florida? That's just sort of the way it is. Okay, oops. So Dan has to run. So Ruby asked, related to finding common ground with policymakers, any advice on which associations are training your researchers to gain skills? So there's, lots of ways to sort of gain communication skills. Like some of the topics that I talked about, I've actually done those for NSPN events. And then, Dan, who actually just left, so it's too bad he wasn't still on, but I know that they have, and that he's from AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I think right now they have an application open for their state and local fellows group. Maybe, somebody who can go online can find a link on that. I think it's called LSEN, I believe. And so I would suggest you consider applying for that program. And that's part of what they're going to do is train people. Oh, look at, thanks, Kimberly, that is correct. Yeah. Yeah, maybe you can give a link for Ruby to do it. So that that would be a good way for you. You could just apply for that program, and then they would give you a lot of the training that you need to interact on that state and local organization. A lot of my students also get involved with kind of like more local. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it's climate something. I'll find it and I'll pass it on to Kimberly, and then she could pass it on to you. But it's an organization where it's kind of advocacy on climate change, and they work locally. And I think they also do a lot of training. And then you can do in the group. But I think this AAAS thing might be the best option for you, at this stage. There it is. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Yeah, and I said I would look at that right away, because I'm pretty sure that the deadline, I know because one of the people I work with at West Virginia University, who's a postdoc, she's planning to apply for it. I know she talked quite a bit to Dan Barry, and maybe Kimberly, you can connect Ruby and Dan too. Oh, Friday, yeah, April 14th. Yeah, I knew it was coming up pretty soon. Thanks, Kimberly. Okay, so here's some other, equity issues. Homeowners versus renters. We were just talking about flooding. And that's really a big issue. So, like some of the FEMA policies, don't help you if you're a renter, but only if you're a homeowner. And this can be really rough if all of a sudden, well, like we just saw this happen in Kentucky, I think Missouri, maybe, it happens all over the United States. Then, of course, we have U.S. citizens versus international. We have big states versus small states, coast states on the coast versus middle of the country, northern versus southern, west versus east, small versus big. In fact, a conversation I had this morning was on this next one: research universities versus small universities. The small universities are having difficulty getting to the table at some of these big organizations. Then we have senior researchers, people who are staying, well into their 70s. Are they taking the money away from junior researchers when there's just limited research funding? And then we have here the states with substantive federal funding, which are Pennsylvania, like where I live, and Massachusetts and California, and states with less federal funding. Those are called EPSCoR states, of which like West Virginia is an example of that. So this is how to do a racial equity impact assessment. So this is part of what I teach my equity analysis class. The most important part here is identifying and engaging stakeholders, those first initial steps. because that's the thing that most people don't do. They just have an opinion without doing any analysis of the issue. And then sort of identifying and documenting these equities, looking at the causes, trying to figure out then what to do, what policy steps to take. So this is an example that I think is a really good one. This is from Chicago, and it's related to flooding. And again, this relates to my thing about flooding being in the center of the country. And that, you'll see here that they have all the kind of zip codes in Chicago, and it's just these 13 different zip codes. And then we have but 3/4 of the flood damage claims are in those areas, and 93% are with people of color. So this is, I think, the last slide. Yeah. Oh yeah, this is the last slide. So this is basically, but I don't think we necessarily have anybody here to do this, but maybe I'm just going to do it to say, like, if you had 5 minutes with President Biden, what policy actions would you recommend that he take in terms of reaching his equity goals? So I'm going to let you just, you just kind of think about that and put it together. Hopefully all the stuff I've told you will help. And then I just wanted to make sure people knew of this NSPN Forefront. So I'm a co-editor on Forefront, the science policy writing competition. So that, beginning basically right now through May, we're accepting submissions, and hopefully you would consider participating in that competition. And then lastly, this is an example from Forefront of some of the policy briefs that were written last year. So for example, this, there's this one here about queer scientists, and then protecting Black women against health ailments from endocrine disrupting chemicals, sort of the inequality of AI. So that kind of gives you an idea of the different topics. And then last here is, my webpage. If you sign up for my newsletter, which is right at the top of the thing, then you can get information on all the free different events that I offer that are typically sponsored by other organizations. And that is a good way to do it. You can also follow me on Twitter down here. And again, find out about all the different events and things that I have. Usually during this kind of season, I have like 2 or 3 talks a week. So one or the other is more likely to fit your schedule. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions from our vibrant audience here.
Thank you, Debbie, Dr. Stine. That was wonderful. For your prompt about President Biden.
What would you recommend?
Well, so I was kind of trying to break it down into a topic that I'm thinking of, which is like Flint, Michigan, the water crisis that's still ongoing, and then trying to break it down based on the 4 E's, or I guess how I would approach it. When you look at the equity, obviously the town that's most affected is predominantly Black. I'm not sure if I'm giving you like what you're looking for, but kind of in this quick turnaround thought process. So like acknowledging that, and I guess working to rectify the situation based on that, and past instances, I guess, of racism and segregation, and tying that into the cost of current versus proposed policy efficiency. And I guess just looking at what's in place now and why.
So what you, So just to kind of help. So I think the most one of the biggest mistakes people make in policy, analysis is not understanding what's going on right now. So, and the reason why this is important, I don't care what this is like when I was in DC talking to federal agencies and so forth, they'll always say the same thing, which is, oh, but we're doing that already. It was just like, so it was like I said, this is just on equity issues. I don't care what it is. Whatever my committee would recommend, they would say, oh, we're doing that already. And so it's really important to understand not only what they're doing already, but, from that 4E perspective, what is not working well. And the only way you can figure that out, and that's why I emphasize that stakeholder thing at the beginning, is to see what the stakeholders say. Now, in this case, like in Flint, Michigan, and so forth, you might not be able to go and like interview people or do a survey or any of these other kind of more formal things. So what I recommend that people do is that they go to Google News and they type in, like Flint, Michigan concerns about clean water or something, or clean drinking water. And then make sure you limit the search to something recent, like certainly within the past 6 months, maybe a year at the most. You don't want to go back further than that because the policies might have changed. And you want to sort of see what happens. And when you look at the articles, then hopefully, here, well, let's tell you what, we'll just do this as an example. Yeah. So. Okay, so the first thing is to go to Google News. And then we're going to type in Flint, Michigan water crisis. And you'll see even somebody's done this here, 2023. Okay, so that, that's only a couple of months. Right here. So look, CBS Detroit, Michigan's still dealing with fallout from Flint crisis 9 years later. Boy, it's been 9 years. Wow. Plus new water worries. So the other thing you can see here is that they just got a $600 million settlement. So what I would want to know is, how is that money being allocated? Right? Because that's really what is there. $600 million. Who's it going to? Is it going to those disadvantaged communities, those people from underrepresented groups, or is it just going to some contractor, and not really helping the people? Like, let's just say you need all the pipes replaced in your house because they have now all been contaminated. Okay. So are you the one who's being helped? What are they doing to support minority contractors and people from underrepresented groups and things like that? So that is, oh yeah, here's this water prosecution, things like that. But that's what I mean by it's really important to understand what's happening now. Because look, this is only 7 days ago that this was approved. And so if I was somebody who was in Flint, Michigan, and I was from, I don't know, let's just assume that there's like an NAACP, either for Michigan as a whole or for Flint specifically. What I would be doing is saying, how is that $600 million settlement being allocated, and how can I get the most for the people that I represent? And make sure that it goes to the community, not to contractors or people like that from outside the state or outside the area, that there is a priority given to people who are local for both the services and both, in terms of like receiving the services and in terms of who is giving the services, providing the services, the contractors, the plumbers, or whatever it is that is being used. Yeah, let's see. So it is. Yeah, so this is basically who gave I guess who's giving all the different kind of money for it. And, so it looks like 80% go to people where minors were exposed to the contaminated water. 18% turned out claims. So let's just take this 80% for people, who had minors, right, and that were exposed. Okay, so this is where that, equality versus equity issue comes in, right? So you want to know how is it, I would want to know at least how is that money being used? Because and there's here the special education services, business losses, but 80%, that's a big chunk of the money, right? So who is that going to? And so it says here, this ruling provides families with much needed medical compensation. Okay, but how do they get access to that money? And so we have like 12,000 kids who were exposed to this lead contaminated water, right? Which is likely to result in like mental health, not mental health, I'm thinking about, developmental challenges. I know this because of another study that was about lead in blood that the CDC did. And they have these other kinds. So anyhow, so I would think, okay, you got 12,000 kids, you got 80% of $600 million. That's a lot of money. Where is that going to? And let's just say that the money is going to the families. Well, what guidance are the families getting for how to use that money? So and this is where science and technical advice can, play a role, is by saying, okay, well, what you really need to do is, I don't know, is there a treatment that will make the developmental impact less? Should I be more worried about my older kids or my younger kids? There's lots of decisions that are very scientifically based, where it'd be good, I'm sure any family, who say if the fund is being allocated by number of kids, it would make a difference. But maybe it's not being allocated that way. Maybe is it being allocated by the people who are most affected? So you'd have to do like a lot more investigation, but you can sort of see how those 4 E's came into effect, right? So is it going to be effective in helping these people from an efficiency standpoint? For the money that's being there, how are they getting the best societal bang for the buck? Which is, in my case, I would say that the societal goal here is so that this contaminated situation has the least impact on the children's long-term development, health, their ability to get advanced education, to get jobs. Then you have equity issues, and so that is things like related to age and is somebody who's a rich family going to get as much as a poor family, or are they going to do some allocation by income? And then that ease of political acceptability, where you're going to have to basically, whatever you're going to do, you want people to kind of feel it's fair. That the people, say that you say, okay, it should go to the people who need the most help, which are the poor families. That might make the rich people mad, right? So what can you do to kind of balance this situation so the rich people feel at least they're getting somewhat of a fair deal? Like they say, okay, yeah, we kind of understand, you got to help these families because we have the ability, we have healthcare insurance, we have things like that to help our kids, and these other kids don't. How are you going to manage that situation? So it's kind of a long answer to your question. So hopefully that helped, though.
It did, and I appreciate you stepping through that in real time with that example. So I appreciate that. I do want to take this time. There were some questions that were sent ahead of the call that I'd like to pose to you. So I'm just gonna share that as a screen and then go back. Oh, sorry. Chat. All right, let me pull that up. Okay, first question. Can you speak to the importance of engaging with your local government and how that can connect to science?
Yeah, so there's lots of opportunities, for you to engage with your local government. So there's a couple of ways to approach it. So the first thing is you need to actually go to your city council, town council, whatever it is meeting. And ideally you will go physically, but these days oftentimes you can watch them on TV and you can sort of see what's happening. So you want to know what it is they're discussing. So that's the first thing. So to kind of see what's on the agenda, is there something where your scientific and technical expertise can help? So I'll give an example. I lived in this township that's south of Pittsburgh, and a couple of years ago we had like a major flood, enough that like one person was killed, and it was because it was a flash flood, and so nobody expected it. And it's kind of like one of these little creeks that all of a sudden became a giant river. And so the person sort of like, because they couldn't get up past the road, whatever, they decided to get out of their car. And when they got out of their car, they got swept down the river. So the question is, in that case, like, what is the local government doing to prevent that happening again? Right. And so I'm, as an engineer or a scientific person or whatever, you can ask those critical questions to say, okay, well, how did this happen? How is it going to be prevented? What it is that, that you're going to do. So that's one thing, just to ask questions. You don't even have to make a statement, but you can sort of have a dialogue and start that. The second thing you can do is, say that there is a planning board of some kind, right? See if you can get appointed to that planning board or that commission, and the one that actually makes a decision. So you don't need to think that you have to focus on your own personal area of expertise. You just need to recognize that it's your scientific and technical training and the critical thinking skills that you have gained that will allow you to contribute to that conversation. The third thing is, if there's something that you think is important to address that's not on the agenda, then almost all city councils, will have, and planning commissions or whatever, there's usually several different boards and so forth, depending on what you're interested in. They almost all have an open mic session at the end where you can make a comment. Sometimes it's only like a minute, but it's at that point you can give your policy pitch. And I know a lot of people think that, oh, that's just a waste of time, but it's not really. You start out with your credentials. You say, I have a, PhD in XYZ from, the such and such university. I've been looking at the data on drinking water quality in our neighborhood, and I found that it's not as good as it should be. It's worse than the township next door. Why is that? Can you explain why? I'd like to kind of see those reports, and hopefully, you get them, and then you go back to the next meeting and say, well, I've looked at these, and then this is the problem. Right? So you can do it sort of in an ad hoc way as well. So, it's all a matter of how much time you have to allocate. These are all like volunteer kinds of things. Most of the time you're not getting any money for doing this. So it's just you doing it. But like I'll give just one more quick example, which is at West, I work with the faculty at West Virginia University. There's this faculty member who was really concerned about kids crossing the street because only like less than 1% of cars stopped on this way to go from the neighborhood to the local school. You know, she just spoke before city council and started putting out like pails with flags in them that people could use to flag down to say, hey, I want to cross the street. Right. So it's another example.
Thank you for that. Second question. What skills do scientists, oh, hold on. What skills should scientists have for strong consideration in science policy jobs?
Sorry, what skills should they have?
Scientists.
Okay. Scientists, yeah. Yeah, so I think the most important thing is analytical skills. So kind of like what I just showed in this presentation, but also like oral and written communication skills are super important because that's what you do in public policy is you do a lot of talking and a lot of writing. So what I recommend that people who are interested in public policy do is to start building a portfolio, particularly of things they have written. And so part of the reason that we started Forefront, which I mentioned there at the end of the presentation, is it's a place you can publish something like at no cost, and you still retain the rights to that article under this Medium platform. And by doing that, you can start to sort of find your voice in science and technology policy and show about what you care about and how to and demonstrate your ability to write and analyze, right? So you don't want to just have like an opinion piece. You want to sort of practice what you preach, which is evidence-based policy. And that concept applies to you as well as to, like you're encouraging policymakers to do the same. So if, for example, going back to our Flint, Michigan issue, that if you would want to do the analysis, of the underrepresented group, the people of color population to say, okay, well, look, these people are already disadvantaged because of past environmental inequities. And you need to show that with actual quantitative data. And because of this, it can be more challenging, for them as they, go throughout their life in society. So therefore they should get more allocation of these funds, as opposed to saying, oh, these people need more money because they're poor, right? Which is fine as an opinion, but it's not analysis. It's not using those 4 E's to make it an evidence-based case, for what it is that you're doing. And so by writing articles, and it's one of these things, just like everything else, you got to practice, whatever it is to get to Carnegie Hall. The same thing is true in public policy. You got to participate in NSPN and other public policy groups, and you'll learn a lot during that time.
Awesome. And I like how it all came back to the 4 E's.
Yeah, it all goes back to the 4 E's in almost everything I do.
Last question from that was sent in. What resources do you recommend when looking for policy-related jobs? Any specific titles?
There is, I would say the most up-to-date document that I am aware of is from the California Council on Science Technology. It's free. It's on their webpage. And maybe you can provide it in the links or something that are afterwards. But some of the science technology policy fellows that are at this California Council on Science Technology that served in the legislature put this together a few years ago. And it's the best kind of easily understandable free resource that I know that's out there. There's also, a few, there's some places where you can take like little quizzes and things like that to kind of figure out what it is that you want to do, which I think is also important. So I talked about sort of like reading and writing, like if you're somebody's like, I like to just stay and do analysis and do my work. Well, there are, like, if you are saying information technology or like to deal with data, there are jobs out there like that. particularly in like cybersecurity and things of that area. So you really would need to think about yourself as a person and what is it that you like to do? Do you like to, be active and involved out and about, or do you like to just, like be like me, stay at home and work on a computer all day long? I did both. Like when I was young, I was out and about all the time. But now, I kind of like being at home with my dogs and so forth, right? So, and if you have kids, that's also a big factor. So, in terms of like how much time you can spend, something that you could do, without kids is a lot harder with kids. And so, it's going to differ at different stages of your life, depending on where you're at.
Those are great points and very insightful, and something for people to think about for sure. Well, if anyone else has any questions in the chat, I'll give a couple seconds for that. Those were all the questions that came in ahead of time. But if not, I just want to give a sincere thank you to Dr. Stine for taking the time today and bringing this very in-depth and very insightful presentation. I know I have a lot of nuggets to walk away with, and as this is recorded, we'll definitely be able to get that information and that knowledge out to others. But again, thank you so much. This was very helpful. And yeah, so on that note, I just want to thank those who are on the call, and anyone else who's attended today. Just want to thank you for joining us for day one of the spring 2023 HBCU. Let me see if there's yes. Spring 2023 HBCU and MSI Science Policy College Tour. If you think of any questions after we close up, feel free to reach out to me at outreach@scipolnetwork.org, and I'll put that in the chat. If you are attending any sessions tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you then. And we also have sessions on Thursday, so definitely stay tuned and come back for that. And on that note, I want to say thank you to our ASL interpreters and to everyone who has attended today, and take care and have a good afternoon, and we will be back tomorrow. Thank you.